of my top 10 about ancient Egyptian art and architecture is to tell you that it does not all look the same. That's a common preconception I think that people have, that it's all a bit, we kind of know what it looks like. It's the Bengals walk like an Egyptian. Everybody looks a bit funny because they didn't really know how to draw. That's not true. There's tremendous diversity. We're talking about a culture that had some kind of continuity for nearly 4,000 years in terms of its political structure, its language, its cultural institutions. But at the same time, it was also hugely diverse. Different regions and centers, different time periods, what materials were available for people to use, what the interests, for instance, of the ruling powers were at that time. That all changes quite a lot, so there's an incredible diversity, more than you would think. When Egyptian art does all look the same, it's for a reason. We've got a modern idea that art is all about innovation and that great artists do things in a new way and a fresh way. But art is far too powerful to leave to that kind of chance. In most cultures around the world and throughout history, art is part of a social institution that's really fundamental to how the power, for instance, in society is maintained, so to how you regulate people and how you express things that can't otherwise be expressed, religious ideas, for instance. And so you can't leave that to chance, and it's important instead to have a body of artists, a group of artists who are trained up in the appropriate ways to do things. And while there might very well be innovation, a new technique, a new material that you can use, a slightly better way of doing something, if you've got underlying principles that mean things look consistent, that actually can be a really powerful cultural message about continuity and endurance, and that was certainly the case in ancient Egypt. Number 3, all those artists, we hardly know who any of them are. Or architects as well. All these amazing pyramids and temples that are built in Egypt, we don't actually have the names that we can link to who we might think of as being an architect or being an artist or a designer. There are a few exceptions, and I talk about those in the book, and that I think really helps us get into the mindset. Number 4 of my top 10, some forms of art were sacred. We're dealing with religious art and some things that weren't meant to be seen, or some things that were so magical and powerful that only particular people would have been able to use them. And that's important to keep in mind, I think. When we're looking at things in a museum, they weren't made to be in a museum. They've got a very different purpose. Number 5, in keeping with the fact that a lot of works of art were for a sacred purpose or for a magical purpose, there was something secret about them as well, that they weren't really meant to be seen by normal people. So where we can go in and look at coffins and masks and statues, all of these things were actually designed to be hidden away, and they were too powerful to be seen by us. That's really important to keep in mind. Similarly, and that's going to be my number 6 of my top 10, a lot of the buildings that you could visit if you've been to Egypt, you can go and walk through these amazing temples, you can visit the innermost reaches of tombs, you can climb up the pyramids if you're so inclined to go inside them. Nobody was meant to do that. Again, these are spaces that were completely off limits. Thinking about the secret and we're thinking about the sacred, we need to talk about mummies. We've got this idea that mummies are there to be unwrapped, that mummies are about dead bodies and they're kind of gruesome, or they're medical and we can probe them, we can scan them, we can reanimate them. Stop right there. Let's question that assumption. Mummies are also sacred objects. Only a very few people would ever have been mummified in ancient Egypt, and that's because they were such special people to begin with that they needed to be treated in that way. And the process of mummification is about completing the process of turning them into gods. And again, a mummy was never going to be seen by anybody except the very few people, the priests, who were responsible for making it. And then it was meant to be hidden away, completely wrapped up, meters and meters and meters of linen, in coffins, in a tomb. That's it. Not on a CT scan screen, not on a mummy, not reanimated and reconstructed for a TV program. So let's think about that. Number 8 leads on from my point about mummies. The reason we started thinking about them in Europe as medical objects or objects for scientists to study goes back to the 19th century invention and development of the idea of race and racial difference. Ancient Egyptians, if they had been alive in, say, the 1950s American South, would not have been allowed to sit at the front of a bus. And it's a big problem, I think, if we don't start to have more intelligent conversations about the kinds of racial bias that gets built into thinking about different ancient cultures, or having this us and them mentality. Again, in the 19th century, a lot of that was in a way trying to claim ancient Egypt for Europe while presenting modern Egypt as this really backwards place. You know, they couldn't possibly govern themselves. And that's a real problem, I think, still today in the way that we think about Egypt and the relationship between ancient and modern Egypt. Number 9 in my top 10 may come as a surprise because I'm somebody who clearly does find ancient Egypt really interesting, but ancient Egypt isn't inherently interesting. There's nothing fundamentally that makes it more interesting than, say, ancient Greece or ancient Assyria or the ancient Maya, the ancient Aztecs. They're all potentially interesting. So why do we today still think that ancient Egypt is so fascinating? For Europeans, that interest in the 19th century coincides with colonial expansion, with the British occupation of Egypt, with the exploitation of Egypt to build the Suez Canal and to grow cotton. For instance, it was and remains a really pivotal geographic location. So those things are how we've discovered, quote unquote, and filtered ancient Egyptian archaeology and its art and its architecture down to the present day, and we have to keep that history in mind. It's so important because otherwise those assumptions go unchallenged. Last but not least is that you'll find it everywhere. You can be walking down a street in many European countries and American cities as well, and you'll see it might be an actual ancient Egyptian obelisk like in London or in Rome, or it might be a building inspired by ancient Egyptian architecture. Again, you can see plenty of these in London. And also works of art. Lots of museums, hundreds, just in the UK alone, have some kind of ancient Egyptian art in their collection. So it's really easy to just pop in and have a look for yourself.